Welcome to the topic of classical conditioning. This corresponds to reading number 2 for the learning section of the class. As psych majors, you've already heard so much about classical conditioning. So I'm going to assume that there is certainly some familiarity, and we're going to cover the basics, of course, but also learn some of the intricacies of it, and very importantly, see how it applies in a variety of different situations. The basis of classical conditioning is the association. And so associations are really what are the core of classical conditioning. What I mean by that, it's that it's easy to think of just conditioning as this like automatic reaction that people make or an animal might make. But we know based on so much research that that reaction is based on an association that we form between two things. To use a familiar example, we can consider Pavlov's example with the dogs, and where he would ring the bell, provide them some food, some meat powder in their mouths, and they would salivate in response to the meat powder. And then he eventually learned that the dogs would start to salivate before the meat powder, the food was ever delivered, right when they heard the bell. So pairing of the bell and the food resulted in this association between those two things, and that's why the dogs would salivate. So we can look at our terms here, and you can see that we have a CS, conditional stimulus. Notice I'm using the word conditional, not conditioning. Not a big deal, but a lot of people in the field will say conditional to reflect that the stimulus is one that is conditional. In other words, it's a learned stimulus. Its importance is conditional. It's not like important from the very beginning, as opposed to the food, which is the unconditional stimulus, the one that is important from the very beginning. It does not depend on anything else. So you can think of conditional as referring to it depending on something else, and unconditional as referring to something not depending on something else, that it in its own right is capable of producing a response or is part of what's going on from the very beginning. So with Pavlov's example, when he rang the bell, that at first didn't do anything. The power of the bell only came after it had been paired with the food, the unconditional stimulus. And so the response here is saliva or salivation, and that response is both an unconditional response in the sense that certainly it happens in response to the food, but it's also a conditional response when it happens after there's been some conditioning and now the dogs are salivating when they hear the bell. The saliva can be an example of both an unconditioned response to the food, no learning required, it's something they naturally do, doesn't depend on anything else, unconditional. But it can also be a conditional response, a learned response that they're making because of that association between the bell and food. And so this is from your reading. It has this section in here where they have some examples that they use throughout the book. And so on the top here they describe, the Pavlov's example. But down here they have an example with a child, Myra. For Myra, there's no food or meat powder. What it is the ice cream truck, right? Ice cream that she's really focused on. That the sound of the truck, this truck jingle, is what she associates with ice cream. She has learned that when she hears that sound, she often gets ice cream. And so now when she hears that sound, it produces in her this anticipatory conditioned response or conditional response, because she's expecting or anticipating ice cream is going to come her way. And what she does then is she runs and asks her mother for money, and then she goes to the street corner to flag down the ice cream truck, right? So it worked for her. She hears the jingle. That gives her plenty of time to run, get some money from mom, run out to the corner, flag the truck down, and get some ice cream. We can see these in a variety of different examples with people. The one with Pavlov's dogs is very similar to Myra's, and it's also very similar to this one here. And so this example involves just drinking a cola. It could be really any drink that has sugar in it, because when your body detects sugar, it's going to release insulin to store the extra sugar away, right? That's if in a person who's healthy, does not have diabetes, this is the normal response. If you regularly drink cola, your body is going to learn to anticipate sugar, isn't it? It's the same thing, just like Pavlov's dogs learned to anticipate meat when they heard the bell, just like Myra is anticipating ice cream when she hears the ice cream truck's little jingle. So the sweet taste of cola, what's that going to be? You can think of that as the CS, the conditional stimulus. Yeah, right? So that one's learned because there's nothing inherent in the taste of cola that is going to produce insulin or anything, but it's paired with sugar. So the sugar is like the meat in the example of Pavlov's dogs, and it's like the ice cream in Myra's example. The sugar is the unconditional stimulus that naturally, unconditionally, from the very beginning is going to lead to the production of insulin. So the production of insulin by the pancreas starts off being the unconditioned response, but it also starts becoming the conditioned response after repeated pairings with the taste of soda. And so people like psychoneuroimmunologists will study the relationship between your psychological states, including associations, and your immune system, because it turns out that just like our insulin response can be conditioned, your immune system can also be conditioned. So as a little summary, down here you can see that I've highlighted the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. So take a moment and look at those. Now the reason I highlighted the unconditional stimulus and the unconditional response is because I think when we look at these examples, that's probably where you want to start. That's the reason for the conditioning to happen. It's the reason that there is a learning event going on. Without those important events, without the sugar, without the ice cream, without the food, there is not going to be any conditioning in the three examples that we've looked at. So the unconditional stimulus is super important, as is the unconditional response. So here's another example. Imagine a teacher yells at a student, leading the student to feel embarrassed. As a result, the student feels embarrassed at school the next day. They might also feel anxious at school the next day. So take a moment and try and figure out, identify off the CS, US, UR, and CR in this example. And again, start off with the unconditional stimulus and the unconditional response. So just take a moment and pause the video and go ahead and do that for a moment. If we start with the unconditional stimulus, that's the thing that makes this a significant event. It unconditionally, from the very beginning, is going to be an important thing. And so in this example, the teacher yelling would be the unconditional stimulus. And what's the student's natural or unconditional response to being yelled at by their teacher? Well, they felt embarrassed, right? So feeling embarrassed could be the unconditional response. The next day then, the student feels embarrassed at school. What's the conditional stimulus? It changed a little bit, didn't it? Right? So we started off with the teacher being the one that yelled, but the student just felt uncomfortable, perhaps, or anxious at school the next day. So it may be that, yes, certainly there'd be some anxiety and hurt feelings around the teacher, but notice that sometimes the conditional stimulus can sort of spread a little bit, and in this example it spread to the school. And so we can see that now the student has this conditional response that makes them feel kind of embarrassed and anxious just at school, unfortunately.